paratroopers. And today I thought we would finish off talking about some of the different air races, and then after this we'll get into the equipment and some of the people involved. And one of the, I'm just going to give a real quick outline, a few of the remaining races. There were so many, there's no way we can do them all, but I had mentioned the Grieve Air Race that went from, as part of the national air races, it went from 1934 to 1939, and that was for airplanes with a 550 cubic inch displacement engine or smaller. And it kept the category open for people who were making small, fast, light airplanes and pushed that technology. In 1929, they had a women's only cross-country air race that became known and nicknamed the Powder Puff Derby, which really is a misnomer because it was as dangerous as any air race and fought just as hard as any of them, but it was open to women only. And that actually went on until 1977. In 1934, there was the Mcrobertson Race. Now this was an England to Australia race that was actually possibly the longest race in the world at the time. I think it was, and it really pushed the technology. Aircraft pretty much had to be specially built. It was won by the de Havilland Comet, which looks slightly like something else. And before that, 1922, England had, for British pilots only, had the King's Cup race. Now this was a handicapped race for light aircraft, and again the idea behind it was largely to push the development of small aircraft. We talked about the national air races, which is actually mini races that were pulled into the national air races, but most people think of the high-speed pylon race. And up until World War II, it was being won largely by civilians, but after by civilian aircraft, although some military aircraft were starting to win. But after the war, obviously the national air races were completely dominated by surplus military aircraft. And unfortunately, in 1949, there was a really serious crash. Bill Odom, who was a very famous race pilot, was killed when his Mustang crashed. And killed a couple of people in a house that he hit also. So that suspended air racing for a while. And there were, the national air races were kind of held off and on for a while, up until I believe it was 61. And, what happened was there were still some more crashes, and I think pretty much everyone was going to put it into the air races, the Cleveland races. It was just wasn't worth the risk. And what were we getting out of it these days? Now the jets were here. They actually had to have a jet category, and so they had props and jets. I know that the Bendix cross country race had to have a jet and a prop category. And they actually, after the war, they were actually racing jets for a while. Obviously, the Air Force was pretty much taking everything. They were the only ones that really had, the jets they could use. Howard Hughes did acquire one of the old captured Me-262s that the American military had gotten under Operation Lusty. I did a documentary about Operation Lusty that I'll link below. But I actually found a photograph of that thing just sitting at an airport, tied down like any other airplane, and it was just, the airplane was just kind of forgotten about. Hughes was going to race it in the jet class, and I think everybody pretty much told, I'm just guessing here, but I'm thinking everybody pretty much told him that these UMO engines were never going to survive the race. And he just forgot about it. And fortunately, the airplane was preserved and is in a museum now. Hard to believe they would scrap something like that in those days, but it happened a lot. I remember back then it was just an old airplane. But in 1964, the race was moved to Reno, and it still exists today as the Reno Air Races. And that way, although unfortunately there have been some pretty serious mishaps, most recently the one with Galloping Ghost, at least the people who were there, they all want to be there. It's out in the middle of the desert, so it's not like the planes, if they go down, are going to run into a private home. The current Reno air races are broken down into 6 basic categories. You have Formula One, which is 200-inch cubic displacement. You have the T6 category, S&J AT6, that's its own category. They have the Unlimited with like Rare Bear and Strega and all those souped up airplanes, which are mostly World War II fighters. You have a jet class, you have a biplane class, which is mostly pit specials, and you have a sport class. And that's where you'll find your Cirruses and that kind of stuff. Of course, 2003, Red Bull started its racing. And there have been various types of air racing that have come up. Not all of them involve aircraft. In 2010, the Parabatics Race began using the parafoils, what we call motorized parachutes. There also used to be a Formula 5 class, which specifically used Volkswagen engines. So there's been all kinds of races, most of them, unless you're really into the racing world and aviation, you probably never heard of them. They're certainly not part of the public consciousness like the old Cleveland air races were, the Bendix and the Trophy. I mean, these are like major sporting events. Nowadays, of course, air racing's largely relegated to a niche. And unfortunately, air racing is as dangerous as it ever was. We've lost Tsunami, the Pond Racer, Galloping Ghost, and these are, of course, obviously operations for very well-heeled operators. And the fact that people were still trying to push the technology. Air racing on occasion still does make advances. For example, the Pond Racer was using a pair of automotive engines, and it was pushing some new technologies, but unfortunately there was a crash. So I just wanted to touch on a couple of those. Last night I talked about the 1927 Dole Derby, which was a race. They just call it a derby. But I'm going to talk about that probably by itself because so much happened. And if ever there was a cursed race, that was it. Probably one reason it only happened once. So fortunately, a lot of this stuff had a lot of newsreel footage and photographs taken, so it's pretty well documented. But that's that. I just wanted to touch on a few of the last races, just to give you kind of idea whatever became. So the super quick timeline, about 5 years, 6 years after the airplane is invented, people start racing them. And a lot of it kicks off in France and is quickly followed in other countries. A variety of races, some for speed, some for distance. Those are the two big things. There were pushes for altitude and load carrying ability, but the main functions of races were either just flat out speed or long range. And of course, this turned into long range speed races, which is where you got things like the Bendix. So then you wind up, of course, with the Pulitzer, the Schneider, the Bendix, the Thompson, the Grieve, the Dole Derby, the King's Cup, the Women's Air Derby, aka Powder Puff Derby, and that leads on eventually to Reno and the Unlimited class, whichever is what most people go out to see, and all the other classes. And air racing still exists today, but there's no doubt that the beginning of World War II marked the end of the golden era, because first off, the innocence was gone. Airplanes in World War I weren't really war-winning weapons, and the airplane still had a certain hint of innocence to it. Following the Second World War and everything, it was dominated by fighting machines, and that's just the way it was. And a lot of guys have tried some interesting things to win races. Put a 4-engined airplane into a race in hopes of being able to win the race by not having to stop to refuel. Didn't win, but it was an interesting concept, and that wasn't a new concept. Other people had put long-range multi-engine airplanes into, for example, the Bendix race to hopefully save time by not having to refuel, using range instead of pit stops. And you don't know until you try. But anyway, these were all adventures, and these guys are up there with the barnstormers and the airmail pilots and the people who started companies like Aeropostale and KLM and Eastern 89 and all the others, because all of these people were part of the matrix, and racing did push the technology. In fact, the last little bit I'm going to talk about with these races before we get into the individual people and the individual aircraft is going to be about one reason they had so many failures and fatalities. There were a lot of propeller failures and a lot of engine failures and a handful of airframe failures. Probably the most famous of which was the Lowell Bales crash, where his GB just comes apart right in front of the camera. And we're going to talk about that, and there's 4 different theories on what happened there. Nobody knows for certain. Kermit Weeks has one of the, if not the only flying GBZ, and he had some work done that uncovered some information, but we'll get into that later. So the thing is that these airplanes and these airframes and these engines, these propellers, were being pushed way past their planned limits by a lot of these air racers. These racers were trying to milk everything they could out of every piece of equipment they got, and they frequently pushed them past the failure point. In routine operations, these pieces of equipment would not have been pushed this hard. That's one of the reasons these airplanes often had very short service lives, at least on the engines and props, is because they were being pushed so far past their expected limits. If I'm not mistaken, if I'm to believe what I have read, the Pratt & Whitney engine, which was, by the way, owned by Pratt & Whitney and lent to Roscoe Turner, was a 1,000 horsepower engine. By the time Turner was done with it, he doubled the power. The airplane just wasn't meant to hold together under that much pressure, and something somewhere in the system was going to give. But that is how you learn what needed to be rebuilt. And it also taught the manufacturers, hey, we can get more out of these things than we thought. So Jimmy Doolittle in the Laird Solution, when he was flying it, they were having all these problems trimming the airplane. It turned out that the airframe was actually flexing, which is why they couldn't trim out the rolling issues with it. So they realized they had to beef up the airframe. They had countless propeller failures. And a propeller failure, a piece of prop or a prop blade comes off. If you're not off that power very quickly, I mean, if you're not Johnny on the spot, it will shake the engine right off the airplane. They had problems on some airplanes because everything was fit so tight that as the engines would vibrate, the cowlings would start to come loose and move forward and actually get chewed up by their own propeller. And that happened a couple of times. So there was just so much that was being learned. And pretty much every pilot was a test pilot in those things. And you've got guys, I've mentioned Steve Whitman and so many others, that built their own planes from scratch and often did surprisingly well. And then you have the French coming in with some of their beautiful cauldrons and just showing everybody how it's done. And but everybody was working with aerodynamics. And a lot of people wondered, how could a tubby airplane like the GB beat these sleeker airplanes? Well, it must just be raw power and lightweight, and that was part of the equation. But it turned out there was a lot more to it, than the Granville brothers had stumbled onto something that we'll talk about when we get to the GB. And as I've mentioned, often the winning airplane was the one that had the most funding, but not always. And we'll talk about that also later. So I just wanted to go over those races and give you an idea what's coming up in the future. This is going to go on for a while. Just a quick note, I go back to work tomorrow for 4 days, probably no content, and I'm going to be a pretty packed schedule. And when I get back, I have things that I have to do. I only have a day or two off, so very, very possible that there won't be very much content until early April. But in April, we build, we video, we model on. Awaiting script approval from Honey.